There is something that happens when you enter a cave. Not a tourist cave with stairs and lights and guardrails. A real cave, one that has waited in the dark for 10,000 years. The first step is always quieter than you expect. Your feet adjust to the silence, your breath tightens, the world behind you falls away, replaced by a new world made of stone, echo, and shadow. This is where the story begins. Not with a kingdom, not with a war, not with a name, but with silence. The cave is in a forgotten valley, not far from the water. Its walls sweat gently with time. The air is heavy with minerals and memory. Nothing about it screams murder. Nothing screams anything. And that's what makes it so strange, because inside, buried beneath layers of dirt and limestone, was a body. Or rather the puzzle of a body, and with it, a mystery that no archaeologist has ever fully solved. The first time anyone saw the cave in the modern era, it wasn't because they were looking for history, it was because of erosion. A rockfall exposed part of the entrance, the kind of slow geological blink that reveals what the world had tried to bury. A shepherd spotted it, or maybe a hunter, no one is sure. What matters is that someone stepped inside and saw bones. Not animal bones, not fossils, human bones. Just lying there, under centuries of dust, waiting. It didn't take long for the news to spread. Scientists arrived, of course. Brushes, notebooks, cameras, scanners. What they found was more than a body. It was a scene, a deliberate arrangement. The bones were sprawled, yes, but there were objects too. A stone blade, a broken pendant, a few scattered beads, things that didn't fall there by accident, things placed with care or with meaning. There was no name for the person they found, no burial record, no marker. But as the excavation continued, a rough picture began to emerge. The body belonged to a young woman, likely in her late teens or early 20s, healthy, strong. She had not lived an easy life, but she had survived the way early humans did, by moving, by hunting, by building fire and community. Until one day, she didn't. The bones told a quiet story, a fracture along the ribs, an odd cut on the jaw. Nothing that screamed murder on its own, but taken together, they raised questions. Too many injuries, too many signs of struggle, and yet no animal damage, no post-mortem disruption. It wasn't just that she had died, it was how she had died, and where. Why would someone place a body deep in a cave? Not just at the entrance, but meters inside, past the light, where only torches could reach. This wasn't a grave in the modern sense. It was a hiding place, a secret. The archaeologists debated endlessly. One theory suggested ritual. Perhaps she was part of some rite of passage gone wrong. Another suggested exile. Maybe she had been cast out by her group, left to die in the dark. But those explanations didn't match the evidence. There was too much care in the way the objects were placed. Too much attention. This wasn't abandonment. It was something else. The cave, it turns out, has a strange acoustic quality. Sounds bounce in odd directions. A whisper travels like a song. Standing inside, you feel watched, not in a threatening way, but in a sacred one. The kind of feeling that ancient people might have interpreted as presence, spirit, echo. Perhaps that's why the body was placed there, to keep her near the gods, or to keep her away from the living. But even that theory falters under scrutiny. Because what's stranger than the burial is the lack of others. Caves used for ritual tend to hold many burials, not just one. They become cemeteries, ossuaries, shrines. This cave held only her. One woman. One moment. Frozen in time. What kind of death creates silence? Not just in a cave, but in the archaeological record. No fire pit near her bones. No signs of tools, food, or community. Just her. It's as if someone wanted to erase everything, except the body. A message written in absence. The pendant near her skull was carved from bone, decorated with tiny marks. Too faint to interpret, but deliberate. It might have been a symbol of status, or love, or warning. The blade beside her was obsidian, black glass, sharp as truth. Not local. It had travelled, as she had. 1,000 kilometres or more, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, until it landed here, beside her. The beads. There were just 3 of them. Small. Shell. Pierced for stringing. They were found near her collarbone, suggesting they once adorned a necklace, the kind of adornment you wear every day, or never take off. One was cracked. One was polished smooth. One was stained with ochre, red, like blood or birth or fire. These are the details that drive archaeologists mad, because they whisper, they suggest, but they never shout. For every answer, 10 more questions arise, and no theory fits perfectly. If it was a murder, why no sign of struggle at the scene? If it was an accident, why bury her with symbols? If it was a ritual, why do it alone? Years passed. New tools were used. DNA sampling, isotope analysis. The soil was tested, the bones re-examined. They learned she had come from far away. Her childhood diet suggested a different region entirely. She was a traveller, perhaps a migrant, perhaps a captive. The isotopes in her teeth hinted at riverside regions, but the cave was inland, tucked in a dry, rocky place. She had not died where she was born. That alone was enough to stir new speculation. Had she been taken? Had she fled? Was this her final stop, or just a waypoint? One researcher proposed a chilling idea, that this wasn't a murder scene. It was a warning, that someone brought her body here to make a point, to leave a mark, to say, this is what happens. Another countered with a gentler theory, that she died in childbirth and her community brought her to the cave for peace, that the blade was a tool, not a weapon, that the beads were gifts from those she loved, a final goodbye. Both stories fit. And neither do, because the truth about ancient mysteries is that they do not end. They wait, they linger, they seep into us like cold air, they haunt, not because they are bloody or brutal, but because they are unfinished. And this mystery, this quiet, ancient scene in the dark belly of a forgotten cave, remains unfinished still. But what we do know, what we can say, is this. Someone carried her body. Someone placed those objects. Someone lit a torch and walked into the dark. Someone knelt, laid her down, and said goodbye. Whether in love or hate, ritual or desperation, we cannot say. But the act itself matters, because in that moment they became storytellers, and we, thousands of years later, are listening. There is something almost unbearable about returning to the place where violence once unfolded, not just as a place of study or speculation, but as a stage where human drama, confusion, and brutality played out. And yet, that is exactly where the archaeologists found themselves. In a wind-swept gorge surrounded by rising cliffs, the river now sluggish and brown, carving its way through layers of history that had seen much and remembered more. The land here doesn't speak in words, it whispers in stone. And what it whispered next was a new kind of disturbance, deeper than bones and older than memory. The earth, disturbed again, coughed up the rest of the skeleton. It was sprawled, awkward and sudden, as if the body had been dropped rather than buried. There was no ceremony, no care, no grave goods or offerings. Just a brutal stillness that felt almost disrespectful, an afterthought of death. But as the dirt was swept away and the fragments assembled, the picture began to darken. The skull had cracked in 2 places, but not through the slow decay of time or pressure. These were fractures with force behind them, deliberate, angular. The jaw was dislocated. Several ribs had been broken post-mortem or shortly before death. One femur bore a sharp notch that some argued could only have been made by a blade, or something very much like one. But there was no blade nearby, no weapon at all. And then came the strangeness. The bones didn't belong to a single individual. There were fragments from at least 2, maybe 3 people, jumbled together in what looked like a hurried deposit. A child's tibia, an adult pelvis, a scattering of teeth too worn to match the smaller frame. Someone had collected these remains, moved them, perhaps even rearranged them. Why? Who goes to the trouble of hiding a body, and then hides it badly? There were signs that animals had disturbed the site long after, dragging a radius here, gnawing a fibula there. But the initial arrangement wasn't the work of predators. It was human, and it was rushed. Still, context is everything. And here, in this dusty fold of land that time forgot, context arrived like an avalanche. A half-mile from the scene, behind a thorn-covered rise, a second sight emerged. This time the bones were clearer. The burial was deep and narrow, almost surgical in its precision. Someone had spent time on it, smoothed the walls, packed the soil just so. But this person too had died badly. One arm was broken and reset long before death. The other had been snapped at the elbow post-mortem. The skull bore a dent, a shallow depression consistent with repeated blunt force. What story do bones tell when there are no words to accompany them? In this case, they told a story of fracture and forgetting, and of someone, somewhere, trying to erase something. The soil itself held secrets. Beneath the bones were traces of ash, not from a fire meant for warmth or food, but the kind that spreads fast and wild, like something burned out of panic. Charcoal remains hinted at pine and oak, easy fuel, plentiful here. Someone had burned something in this very pit before laying a body into it. Perhaps not to cremate, but to cleanse, to cover a scent, or to hide a stain. One fragment, charred almost to unrecognizability, turned out to be cloth, a weave pattern faintly visible, linen or hemp with a tight stitch that spoke of intention, maybe even status. It raised the question, was this person important, loved, or dangerous? And then came the most haunting clue. A small carved object no longer than a finger, made of bone, not jewellery, not a tool, a figure, featureless, faceless, but unmistakably human. It lay near the ribcage, as if it had been placed there with meaning, but its meaning had vanished, lost to the same silence that swallowed the names of the dead. The object echoed others seen across Europe, so-called Paleolithic figurines. Some were fertility charms, others totems. This one was unique, unaligned with any known category. Its inclusion in the burial shifted the narrative again. Was this a sacred object, a warning, a curse? Speculation fanned outward like wildfire. Some researchers began to suggest that what we were looking at wasn't just murder, it was ritual. A killing not born of anger or accident, but of belief. A human sacrifice. It sounds sensational, but the signs persisted. Animal bones nearby showed patterns of deliberate butchering, arranged in circles, charred and cleaned, not for food but for something else, something performative. There were no dwellings nearby, no signs of agriculture or long-term campfires. This wasn't a place to live, it was a place to do something, and then leave. When they analysed the sediment for pollen and spores, the results were unexpected. There were floral traces, poppy, yarrow and henbane, plants known to have psychoactive or narcotic properties. They grow wild across the region, but their presence in a closed pit was hard to dismiss. Someone had used them here. Someone had taken care to include them in this final act, whatever it was. The question deepened. What kind of community does this? Not nomads who stumbled across a tragedy, but a group with repeated behaviours, symbolic gestures. A society with rules and punishments. Was the dead person a criminal in their eyes, a scapegoat, a healer who failed, or something worse? And yet for all the horror hinted at in the bones and ash, something tender remained. There was no random scattering, no chaos. Even in this darkness there was order. Someone had placed that figurine, someone had wrapped the body, someone had dug that pit. Whether out of love, fear or obligation, we'll never know. Pattern, the care, kept surfacing. In the weeks that followed, the team fanned out, following soil anomalies and ground-penetrating radar. 2 more disturbances revealed partial burials. One showed signs of exhumation, bones removed and reburied elsewhere, a femur missing, a skull turned to face the wall of the pit. More questions, fewer answers. In one case, a bone had been painted. Faint red ochre still clung to its surface, not splashed or spilled, but smeared along the ridge, as if following the groove. It was almost artistic, or symbolic. The colour echoed blood, sure, but also life, fertility, war and death. Cultures long after this one would use ochre in burial rites, but this might have been among the earliest. Could this be a burial tradition we've only partially glimpsed? One filled with layers of violence, reverence, and symbolism? Or are we looking at the acts of a single rogue, a killer masking crime in ritual? The evidence pulled in both directions, and so, inevitably, came the theories. Competing, contradicting, consuming. One group claimed it was a sacred grove, a proto-religious site for seasonal rites, where death was part of the cycle. Another argued it was a war zone, where survivors buried their own after raids and reprisals. A third suggested cannibalism, though the bones bore few cut marks. A final theory, the most controversial, linked the site to early forms of justice, a place of judgment, a court in the wild. Each theory had merit, and each fell short. There was no inscription, no clear signpost, just these mute sentinels of bone and soil, waiting for interpretation, waiting for meaning. The rain returned as the dig entered its fourth week. What had once been crisp and dry turned slick and uncertain. Tools slid in hands, markers faded, but the work pressed on, because something here demanded it, not in a voice or a whisper, but in the weight of mystery itself, a weight that made the heart race and the breath catch. It was in this moment, amid wind and weather, that another small clue surfaced, a tooth pristine and oddly shaped, human but not quite right, too small for an adult, too broad for a child. It glinted in the mud like a warning. DNA would later show it belonged to someone not previously identified in the area, a traveller, an outsider, or someone whose existence had otherwise vanished. The team paused, the wind howled, and the landscape, ancient and unmoved, said nothing. But the story deepened, and the mystery grew. There are moments when the past doesn't whisper, it stares straight back at you. Somewhere deep in the rolling wilderness of ancient Europe, where the ground remains colder longer and the forests thicken like secrets, archaeologists uncovered something they weren't prepared for. Not a tool, not a campfire ring, but something colder, sharper, more deliberate. A grave, yes, but not one ball of peace. A death, yes, but not one softened by ritual. This was something else, something wrong. Bones were twisted, not from time but from trauma. Limbs at odd angles, fingers curled in ways that suggested not stillness but struggle. The soil told no lies, it remembered everything. A smear of blood long since faded, but still hinted at by the iron-rich soil. A weapon not left behind, but whose violence was etched into the bones themselves. Blunt trauma, bladed cuts, fractures that bore the imprint of intent. This wasn't an accident, and this wasn't nature. The victim, young, probably in her early 20s, healthy before it happened, and alone. She wasn't buried, she was dumped. The grave, if you could call it that, was shallow. A pit, really, more like a hurried hole meant to hide, not to honour. No goods placed around her, no beads, no ochre, no gentle placement. Her body had been discarded. And nearby, dragged through the earth as if forgotten, lay the faint impressions of footsteps, faded with time but unmistakable in their meaning. Someone had walked away, fast. In that moment, the excavation team fell into silence, because it had stopped being archaeology. It had become a crime scene. But how do you solve a murder when everyone involved has been dead for over 10,000 years? That's the question that now consumes entire teams of forensic anthropologists, paleopathologists, and ancient DNA specialists. You don't start with suspects, you start with fractures, with patterns, with context, and most hauntingly, with questions. Who was she? Why was she killed? And who tried to bury her story? A clue came from her skull. It had been cracked, not by natural collapse, but by a blow, a targeted strike, likely from a stone axe or similar blunt instrument. The angle of the fracture, clean and diagonal, suggested she had been facing her attacker. And then another break, on her forearm. Defensive. She had raised her hand to block it. She saw it coming. She tried to stop it. She failed. The marks weren't the kind of thing left by an animal or by erosion. They were purposeful, intentional, human. But what kind of human kills this way? What kind of ancient society held this kind of rage? When people think of early humans, they often imagine peaceful little foraging bands, roasting meat over fires and telling stories beneath the stars. And while that's true, there is evidence of warmth and connection. It is only part of the story. Because humans have always been complicated, capable of love, capable of cruelty. Even before we built cities, we built jealousies, we held grudges, and sometimes we made enemies. So the team began to dig deeper, not just into the dirt, but into the site's past. Nearby, scattered through the brush and leaves, were other traces. Burnt animal bones, a small flint blade broken clean in half, a hearth that had not been relit in millennia, and something else, a child's tooth. It didn't belong to her, it didn't match her DNA, but it was there, buried just meters away. And suddenly the scene cracked open wider. This wasn't just a body, it was a moment in time, one that had held many players. Was she the mother, a sister? Had the child seen what happened, or had they been taken away before it began? In one particularly chilling possibility, researchers began to wonder, was this woman killed not by an outsider, but by someone within her own group? It wouldn't be unprecedented. Violence within small groups isn't just a modern thing. In fact, it may be far older than we wish to admit. Skeletons found in places like Jebel Sahaba and Talheim in Europe show mass deaths with patterns of trauma suggesting ambushes, raids, even massacres. One pit in Germany held 34 people, all killed at once with clear weapon wounds. Most of them were women and children, no burial ritual, just mass death. And while the case of our unnamed woman doesn't scream massacre, it whispers something equally dark: betrayal. Because whoever did this didn't leave her to be found. They tried to hide her. They tried to erase her. But history doesn't erase that easily. Forensic studies revealed microfractures along the ribcage, injuries that would have left her gasping. Bruises, long faded, that suggested she'd been struck multiple times before the final blow. And something else, a missing piece. A phalanx. One of her fingers was never found. Perhaps it was taken, or perhaps it was lost during the struggle. Either way, its absence felt heavy. Back in the lab, isotopic analysis of her teeth began to sketch the outline of her life. She hadn't been born here. Her earliest years were spent hundreds of kilometers away, possibly across a mountain range based on strontium levels in the enamel. She had moved here as a young adult. That suggested marriage, migration, or something less voluntary. Had she been traded? Was she taken? Or had she come willingly to start a new life? These are the kinds of questions that make your stomach twist, because they move beyond data. They become personal. And still, no name, no voice, just silence. But then there was her hair, or rather the trace of it, preserved by some miracle in the damp earth, a fragment of plaited fibre, perhaps once woven into a braid. It wasn't much, but it meant something. She had taken the time to do her hair, or someone had done it for her. That speaks of care, of presence, of human attention. In her final hours, she had not yet surrendered to death. She had lived, laughed maybe, hoped, and that's what makes it so much worse. One paleogeneticist remarked in a whisper to a colleague, "It's not the death that haunts me, it's the fact that she trusted someone." That kind of trust leaves behind no trace in bone or ash, but it hovers. The gravesite has since been sealed, documented in three-dimensional models, its soil sifted grain by grain. The researchers published their findings, but cautiously. No firm claims, no sensational headlines, just the quiet truth. This woman died at the hands of another, and we do not yet know why, but we feel the weight of it, and in that weight we see ourselves. Because this isn't just a Paleolithic tragedy, it's a mirror. A reminder that violence has always worn a human face, that betrayal isn't new, that sorrow has always carved itself into our bones. The mystery remains open, no answers, no names, but a story nevertheless. A human story. One more death in a world that never stops remembering. The silence of ancient graves often screams louder than the living. In the dark chamber of a prehistoric cave, one can almost feel that pressure, stories desperate to be heard, stories too old to speak plainly. The bones wait, scattered or arranged, sometimes soot-stained or dusted with ochre, and every now and then one stands out. A burial unlike the others, a gesture that confounds logic and lingers in the imagination. This is where science and myth bleed into each other, where a single skeleton can ignite questions scholars argue over for generations. The child in the chamber was young, very young, but it wasn't her age that stirred unrest among archaeologists. It was the way she had been left behind. Not thrown, not forgotten, but delicately placed in a shallow grave in the cave's inner chamber. She had been wrapped, it seemed, in a blanket of symbols, beads, bone tokens, a carved stone with no obvious function. Her arms crossed over her chest, her jaw slightly open as if in mid-breath. This was not a casual burial. It was ceremonial, intentional, and deeply strange. What struck the excavation team most was the care. In a time of constant motion, when nomadic bands moved with the seasons, and survival dictated every choice, why pause for such an elaborate act? The shells adorning her were from a coast many miles away, suggesting either trade or long-distance travel. The pigment on her bones was not random. The strokes were deliberate, and had likely been applied with tools or fingers dipped in water and iron-rich dust. Her grave was a painting, her body the canvas. There's something almost unbearable about that image. A group of people, likely huddled in the cold, perhaps lighting fire after fire just to keep warm, still found the time to mourn, still found the energy to decorate death. In that moment, grief transcended hardship. Loss became art, and the dead child, too young to have spoken full words, was honoured like a queen. This isn't just archaeological poetry, it's scientific puzzle-solving. Each item in the grave gets catalogued, measured, analysed. What kind of shell is this? How far did it travel? Are the pigment residues natural or artificial? Were the tools purely functional, or did they serve symbolic purposes? In the end, the picture that emerges is layered. Some of the items may have been heirlooms. Others may have been made just for her. One had been used by someone else, likely an adult, and repurposed for the child's final rest. That transfer, from the living to the dead, carries a kind of emotional weight we can feel across the centuries. And yet, as clear as the morning is, there's a shadow behind it. Something doesn't quite fit. In the same chamber, scattered just a few meters away, are fragments of other skeletons. Older, possibly disturbed, some burned, some partially buried. There's evidence of fire, of scraping, of bones that seem cut or broken in ways inconsistent with animal scavenging. Some scholars have suggested this site wasn't just a place of rest, it was also a site of transformation, or maybe of ritual, or violence. This is where the theories begin to divide. One camp believes these scattered bones point to a funerary practice we simply don't understand. The dead were processed, not buried but exposed, perhaps even exhumed and reburied later. Another camp sees signs of cannibalism. A third points to ritual defleshing, an ancient attempt to purify the body, or to separate soul from flesh. Each interpretation opens doors into very different worlds. In one, the dead were revered. In another, feared. In the most chilling theory, consumed. What complicates matters further is the tool evidence. Some of the flint blades and bone points found nearby appear unusually fine, not just practical tools for butchering animals, but something else, engraved, shaped, even polished. In some cases they seem too ornate to be merely functional. Why waste time carving decorations into a hunting tool unless it served another purpose? A ceremonial one, perhaps? Or was it never meant to be used at all? Nearby are small hearths, fire rings blackened with charcoal and plant ash. They cluster around the chamber's perimeter as if people once gathered in a circle around the dead. Some ashes contain charred seeds and bones, others seem to have been used for incense like herbs. There's even speculation that plant resins were burned in these fires, frankincense-like offerings long before such trade goods were supposed to exist. But here's the twist. Not all the fires were equal. One, closest to the burial, had traces of something else. Animal fat. Melted over time, mixed with pigment, absorbed into the rock. This suggests something more than warmth, an act of transformation. Was the child's body anointed? Were these flames part of a ritual cremation that never finished? Or was something being cooked? The line between ceremony and survival is razor thin in prehistory, and every artifact is open to multiple readings. It's this ambiguity that drives modern researchers mad and fascinates them. You can examine carbon levels and pollen traces all you want, but you can't carbon date intention. You can't sequence DNA to reveal grief. So they argue, and they imagine. One archaeologist, noted for her controversial theories, has proposed that this gravesite marks not a single event, but a narrative, a sequence of interactions. The child dies, how we don't know. The community is thrown into mourning. They carry her to the sacred cave, a site used for generations. There they wrap her, adorn her, surround her with meaning. But after the burial they return, days later, weeks maybe. They light fires, they leave new offerings. One of them reopens the grave, not to rob, but to remember, to touch, to weep again. Another theory goes darker. The child's burial, with all its tenderness, was an apology. Something went wrong, a rite, a sickness, a sacrifice. The grave was not just a farewell, but an atonement. The cave, a sacred place, but also a boundary, a line between the world of the living and the unknown beyond. The beads, the pigment, the bones, all part of a complex ritual language that we no longer speak. Whichever theory you lean toward, the mystery deepens with each new detail. A single broken shell, a flint knife dulled at the tip, a faint footprint in hardened ash. These are not the grand relics of kings or empires, they are whispers, and together they form a scream. And what of the larger context? This cave is not isolated. Across the continent, similar graves begin to appear in the archaeological record. Some date earlier, others later. But all seem to echo something, a shared impulse, a kind of prehistoric memory. Children buried with care, bodies arranged with meaning, symbols scratched into stone, pigment smeared on bone. It's as if these ancient people, separated by time and distance, still reached for the same idea, to make death beautiful, or at least bearable. In one cave, across the sea, a burial almost identical to this one was found. Another child, another shell necklace, another smear of ochre across the forehead. No one can prove the communities ever met, and yet their rituals match, their grief rhymes. This is where the spiritual questions emerge. Were these coincidences, or was there a deeper cultural link, an unspoken belief system that crossed tribal boundaries and lifetimes? Were these people practicing a kind of proto-religion, something shared in symbols and gestures, passed not in words but in ritual? Perhaps the most haunting possibility is this. Maybe they saw something we've forgotten. Maybe in their fires and their bones and their pigment, they captured a truth that science cannot. That in honouring the dead, we understand the living. That death is not just an end, it's a mirror, one we stare into again and again, hoping to glimpse ourselves. The child in the cave had no name, but her story continues. It flickers in the firelight of imagination. It echoes in the chisels of archaeologists and the quiet awe of researchers huddled over ancient stones. She may have been alone when she died, or not, but she is not alone now. Every time someone asks what happened in that cave, every time someone listens for her voice in the silence, she is remembered, and in that remembering, the mystery deepens. Because maybe the point was never to solve it, maybe the point was simply to witness. There are places in the world where the air itself seems to remember. Caves that hold more than silence, stones that carry more than weight. In these sacred hollows where light flickers only at the edges, the past still breathes, faintly but persistently. And if you sit long enough, still enough, you may begin to feel what others felt long ago. Grief, awe, fear, reverence. Somewhere within that atmosphere lies the enduring mystery of the child's grave. A story that refuses to resolve, that tightens its grip the more we try to unravel it. The cave in question wasn't chosen randomly. Even in prehistoric terms, it held meaning. Generations returned here, drawn perhaps by the shape of the land, the acoustics of the stone, or simply the pull of memory. It wasn't a burial ground, not exactly. It was a space of living and dying, of cooking and carving and storytelling. And within it, someone made the choice to place a child's body in the earth, gently, deliberately, not hidden away in fear, but nestled among the ashes of everyday life. It's that contrast that haunts people, the mundane and the profound, interwoven. Around the grave are the remains of hearths, bones of hunted animals, flint shards from tool-making, everyday debris. But at the centre of it all is this small, sacred pocket of silence. A child, adorned with care, surrounded by symbols we barely understand. In one layer of sediment lies a bird-bone flute, still intact. Was it played during the burial? Was it the child's toy? Or was it simply nearby, accidentally caught in the moment? Like so many questions, it rests unanswered. When you examine the burial closely, patterns begin to emerge, but they don't offer clarity, they complicate. The beads form a curve along the ribs, like a necklace hastily laid, or a garment lovingly draped. Red ochre paints the soil, not in splashes but in traces, swept gently over the bones, not poured. There's a small flint tool near her feet, sharp but unused. Some scholars argue it was symbolic, a talisman for the afterlife. Others believe it may have belonged to the mother, a keepsake offered as a final goodbye. Then there's the positioning of the body itself. The child's head turned slightly to the left, arms folded across the chest. The pose is neither rigid nor random. It suggests intention, even artistry. But what was that pose meant to signify? Was it a gesture of sleep, of peace, of transcendence? The same posture appears in other ancient graves thousands of miles away. How could such a motif travel so far, across cultures with no shared language, no contact? Is this the imprint of a common human instinct, to place the dead as though they are resting?
As the layers are peeled back, the grave becomes not just a scientific subject, but a human question. How do people say goodbye when words don't yet exist? What is grief when it cannot be spoken? These early communities had no written language, no scrolls or prayers, and yet they mourned. The grave tells us that. In a world of constant motion, they stopped. In a life dictated by hunger, they gave time to death, and not just any death, a child's. The loss of a child in prehistoric times was likely devastating, but not rare. Infant mortality was high, disease rampant, nutrition unpredictable. And yet this death, this one, was given meaning. The care placed into the burial suggests that the child was known, loved, grieved. She was not left to the elements. She was claimed, cherished even in absence. This changes how we view early humans. So often they're framed as brutes, instinct-driven beings clinging to life by violence and force. But here we see something else. Tenderness, memory, ritual. Not just intelligence but emotion. Not just survival but symbolism. We see the earliest glimmers of what would later become religion, art, mourning. In this small grave, the line between past and present dissolves, and yet there is darkness too. Some believe the grave hides a crime. There are subtle signs, a fracture on a rib bone, a depression on the skull. Could it have been violence, an accident, infanticide? In such ancient remains, nothing is certain. Damage from time can look like injury. Still, the possibility lingers. If the child died at someone's hand, the burial becomes not just an act of grief, but of guilt. One chilling theory posits that the child was a sacrifice, that the items in the grave, so carefully selected, weren't meant to honour her, but to appease something else. A spirit. A god. The cave, then, would not be a place of mourning, but of offering. The fire circles, the pigments, the patterns, all signs of ritual meant to seal a bargain or stave off doom. It sounds far-fetched, and yet similar theories have emerged from other prehistoric sites. In one cave across the continent, the remains of multiple children were found beneath a large slab stained with ochre, flanked by bones of rare animals. The burial appeared staged, theatrical even. Could such rituals have been widespread, shared across vast distances by oral traditions we no longer remember? Or is the truth more tender, more tragic? Perhaps the child died in illness or in sleep. Perhaps the community, stunned and heartbroken, responded the only way they knew how, with care, with pigment and beads and memory. And if so, the grave is not evidence of a crime, but a hymn, a lullaby in stone, and maybe both are true. Human beings are capable of unimaginable tenderness and unthinkable cruelty, sometimes in the same breath. Prehistory offers no easy answers. It only reflects us back at ourselves, sharper and stranger than we expect. Then there's the matter of the surrounding cave art. Faint etchings barely visible, swirls, dots, strange humanoid figures. One carving seems to depict a woman holding a child, surrounded by fire. Another shows what might be a burial, long arms folding over a smaller figure. These images are not placed at random. They flank the burial chamber like guardians or storytellers. Are they narrative, protective, decorative? We can only guess. What's clear is that the cave was more than shelter. It was a sanctuary, a memory palace, a place where the living came to speak with the dead, or to listen. Even after the burial, people returned. New footprints in ancient ash, new items left behind, a carved bone, a flake of obsidian, a faded piece of fur. These were not offerings for the dead. They were messages, sent across time, hoping to be received. In the modern world, death is often hidden, sanitized, locked behind closed doors. But here, in the cold hollow of a forgotten mountain, death was part of life. It was witnessed, it was honored, and in that, there is something humbling, something sacred. This is what draws people to the grave across centuries and disciplines, not just the mystery, but the humanity, the chance to touch something ancient and feel it touch back. The child may be gone, her name forgotten, her life unknowable, but the love that wrapped her in beads and pigment that remains, it glows beneath the surface, waiting, whispering, refusing to be forgotten. And in that whisper, perhaps, is the explanation we've been seeking all along. The hill was quiet now, but it hadn't always been. Long before archaeologists with notebooks and trowels stood in its shade, it had echoed with shouts and hooves, with the thrum of tools, with the soft sighs of breath too quickly taken away. What was once soil beneath their boots had been something far more sacred or sinister, depending on who you asked. There are places where the land forgets, where time seals wounds like the bark of a tree hiding its scars, but this hill was not one of them. It remembered. And in its remembering, it refused to let go of the mystery it had buried beneath layers of stone and silence. They had returned in late spring, the team of forensic experts, bone analysts, cultural anthropologists. One of the archaeologists, a woman named Clara, began to trace these oddities not through carbon dating or isotope analysis, but through oral legend. She pored through monastery archives and shepherds' tales, looking for mention of rituals, deaths, or disappearances. What she found chilled her more than any charred bone. There were whispers of a hill that devoured memory, a place where you could bring a person and, through the correct rites, remove them not just from life, but from history itself. No name, no song, no trace. The ritual, if it existed, involved silence, fire, and the breaking of a circle. That last part confused her until she re-examined the stone. The spiral was a circle shattered inward. Could it be that the object itself was part of the rite? Or was it a marker left by someone to warn or commemorate what had taken place? Another body was found, smaller, childlike, but not quite. The bones were long, too long. The skull, flattened in the back, bore signs of cranial deformation, not accidental but intentional. Some ancient cultures practiced head binding, but not here, not this culture. This discovery shook the foundation of their assumptions. Whoever was buried here did not belong. They were either brought here from afar, or something had altered their form deliberately. And the burn marks? They were identical to the earlier remains. Layers of mystery were folding in on themselves. Despite the scientific nature of their work, a strange unease settled over the team. Clara had begun sleeping in her car rather than the field tent. One of the graduate students requested to return early. Another began wearing a rosary necklace, even though she claimed no faith. The land wasn't cursed, they didn't believe in such things. But it was heavy, like it had opinions, like it was listening. The deeper they dug, physically and metaphorically, the more questions emerged. There was a shallow trench leading away from the original gravesite, like something had been dragged or walked repeatedly in the same path. Footprints couldn't survive this long, of course, but the compacted earth was different than the rest. It held less moisture, and it traced a curve, not random. A path. Where did it lead? To a cluster of stones arranged like a circle broken by fire-scored gaps. They had found the ritual site. Within this stone circle, they uncovered remnants of ash, bits of bone too small to belong to a full body, and something else. A copper pin, green with age, shaped like a stylized sun. It hadn't belonged to this culture either, which meant trade, or theft, or pilgrimage. The idea of this hill being a nexus began to take shape. People had come here. People had died here. But who recorded it? In the annals of forgotten abbeys, Clara finally found a reference, not to a murder, but to an erasure. The passage was brief and cryptic. Where the sun coils in ash, The name is undone. It was accompanied by a marginal illustration of a spiral breaking apart into flames, the same shape, the same symbol. She brought this to the team, and the theory that emerged was both thrilling and terrifying. The hill had been a place of deliberate forgetting, a sacred site for silencing. But the problem with secrets is that they are never truly buried. They rot, they rise, and they demand to be named. The final clue came not from the ground, but from the trees that bordered the site. Ancient oaks, hundreds of years old, had taken root along the ridge. Their bark bore strange notches, carvings so old that moss grew in their depths. When examined closely, they resembled runes, not Latin, not Celtic, older, proto-symbols of silence, of closing. One matched the mark on the copper sun pin. It wasn't a single murder anymore. It was a pattern, a practice, an ideology. Those buried here were not simply dead, they were meant to be forgotten. But Neve had not been. Her bones were the anchor, the whisper that broke the spell. Through her, the land had begun to speak again. Not in voices, but in evidence, in symbols, in burned stones and blackened spirals, in pins shaped like suns and bones deformed by intention. Through her, the hill had opened its mouth, and the story was just beginning. The storms came earlier that year, hurling cold winds and dark skies over the excavation site, like the past itself was protesting its unearthing. But even as the tents strained against their ropes, and muddy trails blurred into nothingness, the team stayed. There was something buried here, far deeper than bones or blades, something that clung to the land, unrelenting and unseen. It wasn't just about answers anymore, it was about responsibility. Whatever had happened on this hill was ancient, yes, but it was not finished. In the weeks after the discovery of the third body and the strange spiral stone, a new focus emerged. The ash layers from the fire pit held microscopic fragments of parchment, burned too thoroughly to read but unmistakably man-made. Ink traces were found, faded but present, on curled slivers no larger than a fingernail. A written document had once been committed to flames here. A record, a decree, perhaps even a confession. The script was illegible, but the implication thundered. Someone had tried to silence a truth with fire. Clara spent her nights with sketches spread across her sleeping bag, connecting patterns no one else had noticed. The pin, the stone, the burial arrangement, all followed a geometry not natural but chosen. The bodies formed a triangle, the stone at the centre, the fire pit along the eastern point. When she rotated the triangle onto a map of medieval constellations, it aligned with the summer solstice star path. Coincidence, some muttered. Devotion, others whispered. Either way, it suggested planning. This was not a murder of passion, it was a performance. A message carved into the earth with bone and fire. Then the child's bones began to move. Not literally, but as the archaeologists reviewed the photographs and stratigraphy reports, something alarming surfaced. The femur found near the second pit didn't match the rest of the child's skeleton. Different age, different mineral content. It had been placed there, planted. Suddenly they were staring at a curated puzzle, one constructed by hands that understood what they wanted future generations to find. Someone had manipulated the grave. Someone in the past had created the scene now being uncovered. But for what purpose? Was it a trap for memory? A performance for the dead? Or was it meant for them, for the future, for whoever would eventually find it? And if so, what were they supposed to learn? That question plagued Clara through the nights. She began dreaming of the hill, not as it was, but as it had been. She saw people gathered in silence, holding bundles of twine and earth-coloured cloth, whispering around a low flame. Not cultish, not wild, but solemn, sacred. She saw the girl, Neve, not in death, but alive, wrapped in beads, her face painted with red ochre, cradled in someone's arms. Was it imagination, or memory pressed into the soil? The team uncovered another spiral stone. This one was smaller, with a single hair caught in a crevice. Dark, human, long. Tests confirmed it had not been from a local burial. This strand was newer, and it was Clara's. Suddenly, she was part of it. The team recoiled. The implication was unthinkable. Had someone placed Clara's hair in the artifact deliberately? Was she being manipulated, or chosen? Was this all part of something much larger than a dig? The artifacts had always hinted at intention, but now that intention reached through time. Clara found herself staring at the hill differently, not as an archaeologist, but as a character in a story she had not written. And the story was tightening its grip. More symbols emerged in the stone circle, visible only when it rained. Faint red lines like blood tracing through the cracks. When chalked, they revealed a language, not Latin, not runes, but something pictographic. A primitive script of arrows, eyes, and open mouths. The pattern repeated 3 times, first upward, then inward, then closed. A cycle. A ritual. A warning? One morning, just before sunrise, a local farmer arrived at the site. Old, wiry, with weathered hands and a crooked back. He said he had seen lights on the hill since he was a boy. Flames with no smoke. Shadows with no source. His grandfather had told him never to climb the hill at night. Not because it was haunted, but because it was hungry. It took memory, he said. It took names. He wouldn't speak the name of the hill. He only called it the Mouth. Clara listened, and for the first time in months, said nothing. The local records, parish logs, land surveys, contained no mention of the site before the early 17th century. It was as if the hill had not existed, or more disturbingly, had been erased. Maps showed gaps. Roads avoided it. Trees formed a strange ring around it, bending away like iron under magnetic force. The landscape itself was aligned against discovery. Why? Why go to such lengths to hide a few graves? Unless they weren't graves, unless they were seals. The burn layer in the soil was analysed again. This time they used more sensitive equipment, and they found something else, not organic, metallic, microscopic traces of silver woven through the ash. Silver, burned intentionally. A ward perhaps, a binding. The site was not only meant to bury, it was meant to hold something down. But down for how long? The dreams worsened. Clara began waking with scratches on her forearms. Always the same pattern, spirals drawn with fingernails. Her tent walls were found torn, as though from inside. Others began reporting voices, soft and humming from beneath the ground. Still others dreamed of a name they could never remember upon waking. And always, the hill loomed. It did not answer, but it watched. What had begun as an ancient murder mystery had become something far older, not a crime scene, but a reliquary, not evidence, but echoes, and the deeper they searched, the louder those echoes became, until they were no longer echoes at all. They were instructions. The morning came quietly, not with sun or bird song, but with a thick fog that swallowed every hill and tree in sight. The hill stood cloaked in silence, as if the very air had thickened to muffle sound, to slow time. The excavation team barely spoke now. Their voices had taken on a hush not from exhaustion but reverence. Something had shifted. The site no longer felt like a place being uncovered. It felt like a place that had been waiting. Clara rose from her tent with a strange clarity. The dreams had stopped. Not faded, but ended. They had led her to this point, then vanished like a torch snuffed out in a darkened chapel. But the echo of them remained, like breath caught in stone walls, and in that silence, Clara understood what came next. They weren't meant to dig further. They were meant to listen. The team gathered around the central spiral one last time. The stone surface, usually rough and grey, shimmered faintly beneath the dew, a shimmer that no one could quite explain, though each saw it. Light played off it strangely, bending not just reflection but direction, like a ripple on still water pulling the eye inward. At its centre was a shallow groove, worn smooth by touch, not time, not weather. Hands had traced it, over and over. Generations, perhaps. Ritual. Beneath the spiral, they found a hollow. It was not a grave, not a pit, not a chamber.
It was something older. A carved dome in the earth, just large enough for one person to sit inside, curled tightly. Its interior was lined with polished stone chips, all pointing inward, converging like an eye. At its centre lay a bundle of cloth, wrapped tight with sinew. And for a moment, no one moved, because they knew, without words, that this was not meant to be touched. But they opened it anyway. Inside were fragments of human bone, infant, fragile, not Neve. Another. The bones were wrapped in strands of hair, long, coarse, dark. And in the centre, placed with precision, a single object unlike anything they had found. A pendant, oval, polished obsidian, rimmed in gold. Not local, not medieval, something older, something out of place. It was the only object that gleamed, untouched by dirt or time. Clara reached for it. Her fingers hovered, just inches above the obsidian. And that's when she heard it, not in the air, but behind her eyes. A voice, a word, not in English, not in any language she recognized. But she understood it anyway. The word didn't ask. It had been waiting. She touched it. Later, she wouldn't remember what happened next. Only fragments, flash images. A darkened cavern, not made of stone but of memory. Rows of figures draped in furs, their faces hidden behind bone masks. The weight of centuries pressing inward, and in the centre, a child. Not crying, not scared, just watching, eyes wide, ancient and knowing. She woke at dusk. The team said she had collapsed for over 6 hours. No pulse, no breath. They were preparing to call emergency services when she sat upright with a gasp. She didn't speak for minutes. When she finally did, she asked only one question. How many children were buried here? The question silenced them, because it was not the kind of thing one could know, not without more excavation, more tools, more years. But Clara wasn't asking for data, she was remembering. The pendant had shown her, or awakened her, or both. The team returned to the site with renewed fear, not of spirits or death or curses, but of implication. Because if more children were buried here, hidden in ways undetectable by standard tools, then this was no accident of history. It was a deliberate network, a system, a ritual, repeated year after year, child after child. Each grave sealed with stone, each name lost but preserved. They scanned the soil layers again, this time with thermal imaging, sonar, and electromagnetic sensors. The results were chilling. Over a dozen irregular pockets beneath the surface, not shaped like adult graves, too small, too shallow, but deliberate. They had only uncovered the edge, and now they faced a choice, to keep digging or to walk away. One of the younger archaeologists broke down. She said she'd seen a child standing in her tent the night before. Just standing, watching, face blurred, details forgotten by morning. But the sensation had stayed, the quiet gaze, the stillness of it, and the overwhelming weight of grief. Clara said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the pendant. She now wore it around her neck, beneath her coat. She didn't remember deciding to do that. It had simply felt necessary, like finishing a sentence you didn't know you'd started. The soil began to shift on its own. No one saw it at first, but on the third night, while reviewing drone footage, they noticed the changes. Subtle lines in the grass, circles, spirals, patterns appearing between midnight and dawn, as though the earth itself were responding to what they had unearthed. A decision was made. The team would pause the dig. Not stop, not abandon, but wait. Give the site time to breathe. Clara stayed. Most of the others left. She spent her nights walking the perimeter, tracing the patterns in the soil, drawing them by hand, talking to the air though she didn't know why. She lit a fire each night, always in the same place, always with silence. And then, one night, she didn't light it. The sky opened, rain came, not a storm, but a steady soaking curtain, and in the centre of the site the earth cracked. Not a collapse, a parting, as if a seam had given way.
Clara approached with careful steps, holding only a lantern and a single question she hadn't dared ask before. Why me? The crack did not answer, but from its depth rose a scent, not of decay, but of herbs, ash, and thyme. And in that moment, she knew something she hadn't before. The pendant was not a token. It was a key. She stepped into the crack. What she found there is not written in any report, because no one else saw it. When she emerged hours later, her hands were stained red, not with blood, with ochre, and her eyes were no longer searching. They had seen enough. The crack in the earth closed overnight. Not with noise, not with fanfare. It simply wasn't there anymore. No one saw it happen. No tremor was recorded. The soil bore no scars of disruption. But where Clara had stood the evening before, staring into an open wound in the hillside, there was now only smooth stone and moss, as if nothing had ever disturbed the surface, as if the ground had decided to forget. Clara, however, did not forget. She awoke inside her tent with ochre still clinging to the lines of her palms. Its red tint settled beneath her nails like dried blood. The scent of ash and something floral, lavender maybe, or a memory of it, still clung to her hair. But she didn't speak of what she saw, not to the returning crew, not to the scholars, not even in her notes, because how do you describe a place where time doesn't move forward, but circles? How do you explain being shown the same burial again and again, each time older, each time deeper, until the child's bones vanish, and all that's left is the intent? She could still feel that intent. It hummed beneath her feet like a current, flowing not toward her, but through her. The pendant she wore had grown heavier, not in weight, but in presence. It warmed her chest like a hearth, and though she could not remove it now, she didn't try. The team returned with new instruments. They brought a geophysicist, a ritual anthropologist, and even a folklorist who had flown in from Prague after hearing whispers of the site's dream logic. None of them had answers, but all of them felt it, the thing that no chart or scanner could measure, the stillness. It wasn't just quiet, it was expectant. Somewhere between reverence and dread, the hill waited. They decided to build a viewing structure around the central spiral, nothing invasive, just wooden scaffolding to allow scholars and sensors access without disturbing the stone's surface. But as the planks were being nailed together, something strange happened. Every camera battery died. Not once, every time. Fully charged drones fell from the air. Night vision footage turned to static. The air was filled with signal, but nothing would transmit. It was as if the spiral repelled documentation. Not violently, but absolutely. The site refused to be captured. So they tried ink instead. A medieval-style artist, brought in by one of the archaeologists from Bologna, sat beside the spiral for 3 days. He painted in silence, using natural pigments and old tools. On the 3rd evening, he packed his brushes and left without a word. When asked why, he simply said, "It doesn't want to be seen. It wants to be remembered." Clara understood. She had seen memory in motion. That night she sat alone in the centre of the site. The sky was full of stars, and for the first time since the dig began, the wind died completely. The hill held its breath. She closed her eyes. And once again, it began. Not a vision this time, a sensation. Like hands moving hers, like thoughts that were not her own stitching themselves into her mind. She saw a ritual, simple, solemn. A circle of people surrounding a child, not to mourn, but to protect. Not to bury, but to send. It wasn't death they feared. It was forgetting. In the ancient ceremony, bones were not just remains. They were messages. Shells were not decorations. They were markers. And ochre was more than pigment. It was memory. Concentrated, encoded, eternal. What Clara understood then was both humbling and horrifying. The graves had not been built for children who died. They had been built for children who were taken, not kidnapped, not murdered, chosen for something. The word sacrifice is too simple, too modern. These people had no gods the way we understand them. But they had cycles, patterns, and sometimes a cycle demanded an offering. It wasn't always a child, but when it was, it had to be perfect. not in health or strength, but in placement. The right time, the right stars, the right silence. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had seen the records. She knew the pattern of the graves, and suddenly it all made sense, not as randomness, not as tragedy, but as design. Each burial had a mirror across time, a twin, a balance, left and right, dark and light, past and future. The graves were not only marking the dead, they were keeping something in balance. And then she realized what terrified her most. The pattern was incomplete. Someone had interrupted it, centuries ago maybe, or maybe only recently. But the last grave, the one that was supposed to seal the spiral, had never been dug. The cycle was broken. And the site was waking up. The next day the spiraled surface cracked for real. Not violently, not with tremors or drama. It simply opened. A thin line across the centre splitting the stone like parchment torn under gentle pressure. And from within the crack rose dust. Thick, red, the colour of old blood, or ochre. It coated the air, it clung to lungs, it blinded. The team fled, Clara stayed, because she understood now. This wasn't an archaeological site. It was a ritual machine, a clock that marked time in grief and offering, and it had missed a tick. The air became still again. The spiral closed, but it was no longer just stone. Symbols appeared along its surface, glyphs not etched but revealed, as though the stone had been holding them all along, waiting for the right breath to exhale. The symbols weren't language, not exactly, but they were legible, to her. They spoke of hunger. Not animal hunger, not for flesh or violence, but a deeper emptiness, a rift in memory, the kind of hunger that comes when something meant to be remembered is forgotten, and in that forgetting, something else creeps in. Clara traced the glyphs with her fingers. They pulsed with warmth. The pendant vibrated faintly against her chest, responding like a tuning fork, and in that vibration, she heard it again. Not a voice, a name, hers. She was being called, but not to die, not to join the bones. She was being asked to witness, because the site knew it was almost too late. Whatever balance had been preserved was faltering, and if the cycle wasn't completed, the forgetting would spread, the graves would fade, the names would vanish, and with them the line that tethered humanity to its memory. Clara made her choice. She would not flee. She would stay, and she would remember. Even if no one else believed, even if no one else saw. She would be the seal. The mist was thicker than usual the following morning, curling like cautious fingers through the crags and underbrush around the excavation site. Nothing stirred. Not the wind, not the birds, not the anxious humans still huddled around their tents with expressions that flitted between awe and dread. Even the spiral stone, so alive with light and presence the night before, now lay silent. Just another patch of ancient earth, dull and damp. Clara sat alone near the edge of the clearing, where the sun had begun to filter through in narrow rays. In her lap was a bundle of damp parchment, sketches made in the frenzy of discovery, spiral patterns, concentric graves, bone arrangements that resembled something mathematical, something intentional. She wasn't entirely sure what they meant, but something inside her kept whispering, "Don't look away. Don't look away from the story that wants to be seen." They had called in more experts. A historian from Prague with cold blue eyes and a silver-tipped cane, a linguist who insisted she could hear phonetic structure in the spiral lines, as though they weren't just symbols, but sound, and an archaeologist who spoke softly, as if afraid the earth might hear him and seal up again in protest. Each carried their own explanation. None agreed, but all had one thing in common. They treated Clara's presence with wary fascination. She was the one who had stood inside the spiral, the one who hadn't screamed. By mid-afternoon the fog had burned off. Light pooled over the spiral stone in waves, dancing slightly when the wind stirred the tree canopies. It looked ordinary again, but Clara knew better now. She had seen the spiral breathe. She hadn't told the others what she saw, at least not everything. Not the child wrapped in red ochre, not the vision of hands laying her into the soil like a sacred seed, not the soft keening sound that had followed, neither wind nor weeping, but something older than both. It wasn't because she feared ridicule.
It was because describing it out loud would fracture it, make it brittle. A vision that old must be protected, or it might vanish like breath on a mirror. The site expanded. Wooden walkways were laid out above key areas, tarps rigged to shield sensitive artifacts from the elements. Ground-penetrating radar began to scan deeper layers of sediment, searching for anything left behind. But the deeper they probed, the more Clara noticed something strange. The readings kept turning up voids, hollow spaces that seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if responding to their gaze. One technician joked they were chasing ghosts. No one laughed. That night, Clara walked the perimeter of the spiral stone. The wind had picked up again, but it wasn't cold. It was whispering, or maybe humming. She paused, adjusted her cloak, and kneeled near a patch of moss she hadn't seen before. A thin strip of stone jutted out, just enough to catch the moonlight. On it, carved faintly, was a symbol that looked like an eye, surrounded by broken lines. Not unlike the glyph on her pendant. She didn't remember falling asleep, but she woke in her tent with dirt under her nails and red smears on her palms. Not blood, ochre. Again. This time, it had dried across her forearms too, as if she'd been marked. The historian from Prague confronted her that morning. His voice was gentle but clipped. He wanted to know where she had found the pendant. She said nothing. He insisted. She remained silent. Then he said something odd. That the pendant was not unknown. That similar items had been recovered before, but never spoken of publicly. Never recorded in full. Clara asked why. He didn't answer. By noon, the spiral stone was closed again. Not physically, but metaphorically. The energy was gone. Clara felt it first, then others agreed. No more light, no more tremble beneath the soil. It had gone back to sleep, or simply turned its face away. The team grew restless. New theories were floated, most of them increasingly disconnected from the evidence. One posited that the site was a Neolithic sundial. Another insisted it was a burial map matching celestial constellations. Clara listened, but her mind was elsewhere. Not in the sky, but underground. She began cataloguing the artifacts with new attention, not just as objects but as components of a language. Flint knives that formed patterns, beads arranged with rhythm, charcoal drawings on cave walls that repeated in cycles. The whole site, she realized, was a manuscript, and someone, long gone, had authored it. Late one night she lay awake listening to the trees. That's when she heard it again. A breath. Not hers. Not human. But familiar. Like a child sleeping nearby. She got up, barefoot, and stepped into the cold night. The spiral stone wasn't glowing, but something near it was. A faint shimmer in the earth, as though the dew had taken on memory. She followed it, past the spiral, into a wooded edge they hadn't explored. That's where she found it, a cluster of smooth stones arranged in a half-circle, covered in moss. One of them was etched, the same spiral but reversed, not inward but outward, as though something had left the spiral, or been released. In the morning she led a small group to the site. They excavated quickly. Beneath the stones they found ash, bones, and what looked like burnt fabric. The historian called it a cleansing pit. The linguist said it was a sacrificial circle. Clara said nothing. That night she dreamed of a woman, eyes dark, hands red, cloak heavy with rain. She was walking away from a cradle made of stone, singing softly to herself in a language Clara did not understand. Behind her the spiral glowed, then it cracked. Light poured out, not upward, but into the soil. When Clara woke, the pendant was gone. She searched everywhere, but it had vanished. Only a faint spiral remained on her chest, drawn in ochre she could not wash away. The others began to notice her silence, her detachment, the way she walked the site alone, whispering to herself. Someone said she looked haunted. Another said she had seen too much. But Clara was not haunted. She was remembering. She knew now that the spiral was not a warning or a trap or even a mystery. It was a message, not from the past to the future, but from death to the living. An echo. and every child buried within it had been a note in that song. Not forgotten, just waiting to be heard again. The team prepared to leave as the season ended. Tents came down, crates were packed, papers were signed and sealed. But Clara stayed behind. Just one more night, she said. Just one more hour by the stone. She sat in silence as the stars came out. This time there was no light, no glow, just silence. And yet she felt fuller than ever, as though all the fragments had assembled in her chest and become something whole. Not an answer, but a truth. The spiral didn't explain. It didn't solve. It reminded. In the morning, Clara was gone. Her tracks led into the woods. The pendant was never found. Only the faint spiral, carved again on the stone, fresh, perfect and open, and beneath it one shell bead, dusted in red ochre.
The mountain doesn't speak. Not in words. But if you sit long enough beneath its shadow, if the wind shifts just right through the pine needles and the bones of rock, it almost hums with memory, a low, ancient echo, like breath through a cathedral. And those who walk its winding paths know they are not alone, not entirely. By now, the site has revealed many things. Not answers, exactly, but patterns, suggestions. The body, still unnamed in any official capacity, remains the central riddle, splayed in a pose too human to ignore, too theatrical to dismiss. Everything about its positioning, its adornment, its silence, it all speaks of a crime committed not just in violence, but in ritual, a performance frozen in time. What has become undeniable to the archaeologists, the forensic anthropologists, the cultural historians poring over this strange tableau, is that the murder was not born of impulse. It was deliberate, carefully staged. The implements used, if they could be called that, were not crude, they were symbolic. And the placement of the body, with its limbs deliberately bent, one hand open and the other clenched, marked not a hurried burial, but a message, to someone, to something. But still the central question hangs heavy in the thin alpine air. Who was this person? The carbon dating suggests an age somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 years, late Mesolithic, or very early Neolithic, a time of flux, of transition. Across much of Europe, small bands of hunter-gatherers were beginning to brush against the early waves of farming communities. There were exchanges of goods, sometimes of genes, but there were also conflicts, jealousies, cultural dissonance, the old ways clashing with the new. And this body, this victim, may have stood right at that threshold. Some have speculated he was a seer, a figure who wandered between tribes, carrying news or prophecy. The particular placement of ochre powder around the shoulders and neck, so faint it was only visible under ultraviolet light, reminded one specialist of burial patterns seen in early shaman graves in the Danube basin. But others push back. Too easy, they say, too romantic. Maybe he was a traitor. Maybe he was punished. Maybe he wasn't honoured, but condemned. Then again, why leave him in such a visible place? The ridge where the grave was discovered isn't easy to access, but it is prominent. From the right angle, it overlooks a valley cut with ancient trails, paths still used today by shepherds and hikers. In Mesolithic times, it may have been a lookout point, or even a seasonal migration pass. To place a body there was to invite notice, to invite memory, whether in reverence or in warning. Even stranger is what was found beneath him. Layers of sediment had long compressed around the skeleton, forming a tight cocoon of mineral-rich soil. But at its deepest point, just beneath the pelvis, researchers unearthed something unexpected. A shallow basin of scorched earth, ringed by blackened pebbles, as if a small fire had been kindled, not large enough to cremate, not even large enough to warm, but present and deliberate. Tiny fragments of charred wood and a single feather, species indeterminate, too degraded for analysis, were all that remained. What ritual calls for such a fire? A fire after death? A fire to summon or to ward? There are precedents, of course, scattered hints from Siberian burial grounds, parallels drawn from Sami ancestral customs, but no direct lineage, no clean line of cultural descent. The connections are intuitive, emotional, shadows on the cave wall of history. And then, there's the knife, or what was once a knife,
recovered just centimetres from the corpse's right hand. The blade is barely more than a shard, a sliver of flint, its edge still razor-fine despite the centuries. But what draws attention is its haft, or rather, what's left of it, a sliver of antler carved with faint, looping marks. Not quite writing, not quite art, but intentional. The symbol appears nowhere else on record. No known script, no matching motif from contemporary sites, just a spiral, imperfect and asymmetric, like a whirlwind, drawn by someone who had seen one once and never again. Some suggest it represents the soul. Others say it's a warning. One particularly poetic curator offered that it might be a map of the stars or of a mind. But what kind of mind leaves this behind? One theory, whispered among the team but not yet published, suggests that the body may not have belonged to the same cultural group as those who buried him, that the murder was not personal but cultural, a ritual sacrifice made not in hate but in awe, an outsider, captured and repurposed into myth. It's not as far-fetched as it seems. Burials with similar overtones, overkill, symbolic mutilation, excessive ornamentation, are known from the later Neolithic. Sites like Herxheim in Germany, where hundreds of dismembered skeletons were found in ritual pits. Not random violence, but something rehearsed, remembered, passed down. Could this grave be a proto-version of that tradition? And then, almost as if to complicate things further, the grave offers one last surprise. Near the edge of the burial pit, hidden in a pocket of clay, a single human tooth, deciduous. A child's, milk-white and unbroken, unburned. It doesn't match the adult skeleton, different age, different wear patterns, and no other child remains nearby. No sign of a second body, so why is it there? Was it placed as a token? A relic? Was the child a witness, a sibling? Or was the tooth symbolic? A stand-in for something lost? Whatever the answer, the effect is chilling. A child's tooth in the grave of a murdered adult. 2 lives, tangled across time. A private tragedy etched into the public memory of soil and bone. In the face of all this, the team does what they can. Catalogues, comparisons, cross-referencing. But more and more, the evidence resists narrative. It doesn't unfold, it circles. And maybe that's the point. Because what if the grave isn't a story, but a symbol? What if its whole purpose was ambiguity, to raise questions, to provoke reverence, to haunt? There are myths in many cultures of sacred victims, chosen not for guilt, but for meaning, killed not in anger, but in ritual clarity. Their deaths are not ends, but beginnings, vessels into which entire communities pour their fears, their grief, their hope. Perhaps this man, this body, was such a vessel. Perhaps that is why his face still holds, why his hands were posed, not flung, why his bones were cleaned by careful fingers and not by time. He is not a murder victim. He is a monument of blood. The archaeologists don't say this aloud, of course, not in reports, not in press releases, but in the late hours around the campfire, when the wind howls just right and the stars seem too close, the talk turns solemn. There's a sense almost that they're being watched, not with malice, but with memory. Like the mountain remembers, like the earth does not forget, and in those moments they all feel it. Not the solution, but the weight of the question, the chill of it, the vastness. This is not just a grave, this is a doorway, and they have only just begun to knock. The wind that moves across ancient landscapes does not speak, but it remembers. It threads itself through valleys, brushing past standing stones and ruins, carrying memories not in words, but in sensation, in silence, in cold, in the way light falls just so across an empty hill where something once happened. There, in that quiet, we meet a truth older than cities, that violence, mystery and memory have long been intertwined, that some places are stained not by blood, but by questions that refuse to fade. And it is in one of these places that our story still lingers, waiting to be finished by people who will never arrive. By now, those who've been following this strange and ancient puzzle are asking the same question that every archaeologist, every forensic analyst, every historian eventually confronts. How do you know what you know when everything you're studying is long dead? You hold bone, you study ash, you examine the way rock fractured under impact, and wonder, was this a tool or a weapon? Was this a burial or a concealment? Was this an accident or something deliberate? Every inch of ground in a murder scene whispers in riddles, and when that scene is 10,000 years old, even the riddles have grown tired of being asked. But even in this fog of uncertainty, patterns emerge. The body, or what remains of it, speaks. Not in voice, not even in form, but in fracture. The curve of a rib, the impact to a skull, the tension in the wrist bones where someone may have been tied or held down. These are not accidents of geology. These are the scars of action, of intention, of harm. And slowly, inch by inch, scientists and storytellers alike try to assemble not just a timeline, but a human moment, the final breath, the panic, the confrontation, the silence after. It is tempting to romanticize the ancient world, to imagine the people of prehistory as either noble savages or enlightened beings, untouched by the corruption of modern society. But violence is not modern. Neither is jealousy. Neither is desperation, or fear, or betrayal. These are as old as breath. And when we look at a crushed sternum or a blade-marked shoulder, we are not just seeing anatomy. We are seeing choice, or rage, or the echo of a very old mistake. Still, not all wounds are visible, not all evidence survives. And as researchers dig deeper, both literally and figuratively, they find themselves faced with contradictions. Burial positions that make no sense. Objects that seem placed with care beside bodies that appear to have died in terror. Sometimes a grave is not a grave. Sometimes it is a cover-up. And sometimes it is both.
In one particular cave chamber, long thought to be a ceremonial space, a closer examination of the sediment layers revealed something unexpected. A layering of materials too orderly to be natural, yet too chaotic to be ritual. Burnt bone, but not in a hearth. Beads, shattered, not worn. A skull, cracked not by time, but by impact. This was not a resting place, this was a hiding place. And someone, long ago, had tried to ensure that whoever lay there would not be found. The body itself, or what was left of it, was female. Young, no older than 20. Her teeth worn smooth by a coarse diet. Her pelvis narrow, indicating she may never have borne children. Her tibia showed a healed break from years earlier, suggesting a fall or injury. But none of that prepared the team for what they found in her hands, or more precisely, clutched between what remained of her fingers. It was a tool, a flake of obsidian, razor sharp even millennia later, stained at the edge with an iron oxide residue that, under certain tests, closely resembled hemoglobin. It was not ceremonial, it was not decorative, it was meant to cut. And based on its placement, it might not have been used defensively. It may have been used first. What story does that imply? A murderess? A last act of defense? A ritual gone wrong? Or was this woman part of something we've never considered? A fight for survival in a context we can no longer imagine? The forensic team remained cautious. Too many times stories have been built on hope rather than evidence. But even cautious voices can't ignore the arrangement. The tool in the hand, the fractures on the ribs, the position of the body, tucked sideways, legs curled, as though shoved hastily into a space meant for refuse, not remembrance. And then there's the other layer, figurative and literal. Above this woman's body, separated by nearly 30 centimetres of compacted debris, lay another. Male, middle-aged. Face down, arms broken post-mortem. No grave goods, no ochre, no ornaments. Just bone, weight and proximity. And though the two individuals were buried centuries apart, their stories now intertwined, researchers began to question whether the second burial was a coincidence or a cover. Had someone hidden her? Had someone buried him atop her as a mark of disrespect, or worse, as a way to erase? And if so, who are these people to each other? Here's where the evidence runs thin, and imagination fills the cracks. But imagination, when grounded in science, becomes a kind of ghost hunting. We know the soil layers, we know the climate shifts, we know when obsidian entered the trade routes of the region, we know what foods were available, what predators roamed, what tools were used, and which pigments were valued. And slowly, a world is rebuilt, not just of facts, but of feeling. We see a firelit cavern, a storm outside,
We see people gathered, not around a hearth, but around a decision. Someone has wronged the group, or someone has endangered the fragile balance of life in a season already stretched thin. There is a confrontation. Words we will never know are shouted in a language we cannot reconstruct. And then, silence. A decision is made, a life is taken. But even that is too simple. Because in another scenario, she was not an outsider. She was not a criminal. She was a scapegoat, a sacrifice. A person chosen for reasons now buried in ideology we can't name. A blood offering to spirits we no longer understand. That blade in her hand, it might not have been hers. It might have been placed there later to confuse, or to absolve, or to accuse. And so, the ancient murder scene spirals outward. Each new clue draws new theories, each theory branching like a tree into more questions. In one version, the killer was her lover. In another, her rival. In another, she was both killer and killed. The blade used first on another and then turned on herself. There's a fracture on the radius that suggests a blade drawn across the forearm, a mark that, even now, defies certainty. Defensive wound? Suicide attempt? Ritual marking? No one knows. But what remains undeniable is that these people, these stories, refuse to lie still. They demand interpretation, and in that demand they force us to ask deeper things. Not just about who died or how, but about why we're so drawn to these mysteries in the first place. Maybe it's because murder, especially ancient unsolved murder, is a kind of mirror. It reflects back not only the violence of the past, but the curiosity of the present. It shows us our need for narrative, our hunger for explanation, our inability to leave a mystery unprobed. And so, scientists keep digging, storytellers keep speculating, and somewhere in the darkness of that cave, where two bodies lay for centuries, the truth waits, not to be revealed, perhaps, but to be approached with enough humility that we stop trying to own it and instead begin to listen. Because sometimes the point isn't solving the mystery. Sometimes the point is letting it haunt you, letting it ask you things you didn't expect to be asked. Who would you bury? Who would you protect? What would you be willing to forget in order to survive? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what truths might you one day leave behind for someone else to misinterpret? The shadows at the edge of that ancient riverbank haven't faded. If anything, they've deepened. Long after the first bones were discovered, long after the forensic teams packed up their tents and notebooks, the mystery has only grown more complex. There's something about the way the earth held on to this moment, like a clenched fist refusing to release its final clue. Archaeologists speak often about layers, soil layers, cultural layers, stratigraphy, but there are other layers they don't always write down. The layers of story, of grief, of trauma that seeps not just into dirt, but into memory. And this site, more than most, feels soaked in something unspoken. Some say the bones were arranged, not carefully, not with the precision of a ceremonial burial, but with a kind of hasty choreography, as if someone had tried to make them disappear, then thought better of it. Limbs tangled awkwardly, skull turned away, fingers splayed. It doesn't speak of reverence, it speaks of panic, of guilt, of fear, the kind that doesn't end when the act is over. Forensic analysts returned to the photos. They zoomed in again and again on the marks that crossed the rib cage, the deep scoring near the shoulder blade, and that curious fracture along the base of the skull, part impact, part shearing. These weren't the kind of wounds you'd get from falling into a ravine or clashing with an animal. These were purposeful, personal, the kind of marks another human leaves behind. But what kind of human? That's where the narrative frays, because what this crime scene lacks, what all of them lack, is context. No diary, no witness statement, no murder weapon left behind in the reeds, just scars on bone and the faint echo of a life cut short. One theory suggests it was a revenge killing, that the victim had taken something, land, honour, a loved one, and paid the price. But others suggest something more chaotic, that it was a spontaneous eruption, a fight turned fatal, rage unleashed with no warning, that perhaps the victim had no idea it was coming, that their last breath was drawn in confusion,
not fear. Then there's the angle no one wants to consider out loud, that this wasn't a murder at all in the way we define it, that it was a sacrifice, a ritual, a human offering made to appease something ancient, an angry god, a failing harvest, a death in the clan that demanded balance. And if that's the case, then the perpetrator may not have seen themselves as guilty at all. They may have seen themselves as righteous. The unsettling part is how plausible all of it seems. Our species has worn every one of those masks. Vengeful, impulsive, spiritual, cruel. There is no single face to put on the killer. Only possibilities. What haunts the modern mind, perhaps, is the silence, the eerie absence of closure. In a courtroom, there's a verdict. In a film, a resolution. But here, there is only soil, shadow, and speculation. The bones don't speak. The ground doesn't confess. And yet some researchers insist there is still more to be found. They believe in data, in residues not yet tested, in pollen still clinging to fibrous tissue, in isotopes that might one day tell us where the victim drank their last sip of water. They speak of hope in the way only scientists can, hope bound to the microscope. But others just sit with it, with the ache of not knowing, with the unsettling possibility that some things are meant to remain unclear. That mystery is as much a part of the human condition as breath or blood. There's a danger in certainty, a comfort that tempts us to stitch stories too tightly. Perhaps the gift of this site is not answers, but questions. What makes a person turn violent? What threads snap before someone becomes capable of killing? And how do we, standing thousands of years later, separate the murder from the myth? Somewhere in the midst of it all, the victim waits, not for justice, not even for remembrance, but for understanding. For the whisper of a voice that says, "I see you. I see what was done, and I will not look away." Maybe that's the most we can offer. Not closure, not clarity, but attention, respect, the willingness to sit in the dark beside the unknown and not fill the silence with lies, to let the mystery breathe. Because even now, after all the theories, after all the scans and reconstructions, one fact remains unshakable. Someone died. Not a symbol, not a case study, a human being. And someone else ended their life. That ancient act, whether cold or chaotic, justified or monstrous, still sends ripples through time, through soil, through us. And until we know more, we carry the weight of not knowing, of wondering, of imagining the final scream that never reached the sky. The scene remains, bones in a shallow grave, soil disturbed, then settled again, questions fluttering like ash, and all we can do is keep asking. The world we live in is haunted by what we've lost. Not just the people or the empires, but the moments, the small, raw pieces of history that slip through our fingers without leaving behind names or explanations. The ancient murder at the centre of this story doesn't stand alone, it echoes. Across continents, across centuries, across the brittle edge of human memory. Archaeologists don't talk about ghosts, not in their journals. But what else would you call the feeling that creeps into your spine when you stand at a dig site and realise the silence isn't empty, it's expectant? As if the ground remembers, as if the earth itself still recoils from the violence it once held. There is another burial site, far from the original cave, different region, different era, but a chillingly similar energy. A young woman's remains crumpled unnaturally, as if she'd fallen from a great height or been pushed. Her bones show signs of healing, older injuries long endured, perhaps from a life spent in hardship, but the final blow, an unmistakable strike to the side of the skull, tells a darker story. She didn't simply die, she was ended. And again, no answers, no weapon, no inscription, only context. She was buried hastily without offerings, on the fringes of her community's known territory, not in a place of honour, more like disposal than ceremony. And still, the questions rise. Was she an exile, a scapegoat, or someone whose death had to be hidden? Modern eyes scan these sites with algorithms, with infrared, with isotope testing and 3D scans. There's something older than technology we use too. Intuition. And the unease is consistent. These aren't just deaths, they're ruptures, social fractures preserved in bone and dirt. And just when one thinks the past has shown all its secrets, another detail surfaces. A trace of blood protein still preserved on a stone tool. It matches human, but it's not the owner's. That suggests a confrontation, a struggle. Someone fought, someone bled. The anthropologists who piece these puzzles together know they're working backwards through smoke. Every layer of time distorts the truth. The soil compresses not just bodies, but stories, motives, emotions. What we find isn't the act itself, it's the echo. And yet, echoes can still scream. Back in the cave, the murder scene that began this journey remains a tangle of uncertainty, but it has changed the way scholars view early human society. Once prehistory was seen as a steady march from savagery to civilization, but this grave and others like it challenge that idea. They force us to admit that violence was always with us, not as an aberration, but as a part of the human equation. That isn't comfortable. It isn't a noble tale, but it may be true. Even so, violence tells only part of the story. Alongside every ancient murder are other, softer traces, hints of healing, of care, of someone living long enough to recover from wounds, someone feeding the injured, someone staying close through fever or famine. These small mercies are buried too, because for every person who was struck down, there was someone who paused, who wrapped the body, who dug the grave, even in secrecy or fear. Those gestures matter. They are the first attempts at redemption, even if no one dared speak it aloud. The forensic teams often say, you learn the most from the bones that were broken just before death, the fresh trauma, because that's where the moment crystallized, between breath and silence, between decision and regret. And that space, however brief, contains everything. The story of the victim, the story of the killer, and the story of a world where life could end in a flash, without warning or reason. One expert revisiting the murder scene in recent years described it like this. It's not a grave, it's a message, one we haven't figured out how to read yet. That sentiment lingers, because no matter how many tools we bring, how many models we render, the truth remains partly out of reach. This wasn't a history written with ink. It was written with blood, dirt, and silence. And now we are the ones trying to decipher it, centuries too late. And maybe always slightly off-key. Still, we keep digging, not just in the literal sense, with trowels and brushes and sonar scans, but in the deeper sense, in our minds, our stories, our hunger to connect with those who came before us. Because we don't want to let them vanish. We want to know who they were, what they feared, who they loved, what they died for, and sometimes what they were killed for. These aren't just academic questions, they're personal. Because when we stare into the mystery of an ancient murder, we're not just trying to solve a crime, we're trying to understand ourselves, what we're capable of, what we're still capable of. And that is why this scene, this grave, this moment suspended in dirt, matters. Because it dares to hold a mirror to our most primal instincts, to ask, quietly, urgently, if it happened then, could it still happen now? Could it be happening still? The evidence doesn't answer. It only invites us closer. And we come. Every time. The sky was grey when they came. Grey not with storm, but with that dull flatness that blankets a landscape untouched for millennia. Beneath their boots the soil was damp, rich, loamy, and hiding things it had no business keeping secret. They didn't know exactly what they would find here, only that something had once happened on this ridge. Something awful, something never explained. It wasn't the first time researchers had walked the hill. Locals had told stories for years, of strange bones surfacing after a rain, of rust-coloured stains in the dirt that didn't quite match iron, and of shadows at dusk that made even the most practical farmers turn their heads faster than they'd like to admit. But this time the team came with a plan. They came to dig, and the earth, it seemed, was ready to speak. What they found first wasn't surprising. Scraps of pottery, a few broken tools, fragments of stone walls that might once have framed a home or shrine or something more ambiguous. But it wasn't until they reached the third trench, angled low near the bend of the hill's shoulder, that they uncovered the first real whisper. It was a skull, human, small, but not infant small, not adult either. It lay face down, half buried in a pocket of clay, the jaw separated from the cranium by what appeared to be force, not age. There were no grave goods, no careful alignment, just bone in earth, as though someone had wanted it forgotten. The team paused. They marked it, documented it, and called in the osteologist, and then they kept digging. More bones, a radius, a femur, a hand that still curled, almost protectively, over a shattered rib cage. It took days before the full shape emerged. What had once been a young woman, maybe 15 or 16, twisted onto her side and tucked like a question mark into a pit with no lining, no cover, and no reverence. But what caught their attention wasn't the body. It was the iron blade, still lodged between her vertebrae. That's when the narrative began to shift. For months they analysed everything. Soil composition, pollen spores, the blade's metallurgy, and slowly a picture formed, not just of a burial, but of an execution. A girl killed with precision, left unburied for some time, then hastily pushed into the soil when someone, perhaps out of guilt or fear, tried to erase the scene. She wasn't the only one. The next trench revealed a second skeleton. Male, older, face shattered, ribs broken not by decay but by something heavy and fast. Then another. A child this time, no more than 8. Then a fourth, a fifth. 11 individuals in total, buried in no clear order, no family groupings, no consistent age or sex pattern. It was, to put it bluntly, a massacre site. But what baffled the researchers wasn't just the violence, it was the silence. There were no signs of siege, no evidence of warfare in the surrounding structures, no burnt timbers, no arrowheads, no mass graves of enemy combatants. These people hadn't died in battle, they had died in secret, and perhaps most chillingly, they had died alone. As they traced the soil layers outward from the bodies, they found signs that life had gone on mere meters away. Hearths had been used, seeds had been planted. Other homes, untouched, stood nearby, suggesting that whoever killed these people did so not in a moment of chaos, but in a pocket of isolation, watched by neighbours who either didn't know or chose not to intervene. It was murder, yes, but it was also memory, buried deep. The real question was why. As the researchers sifted deeper, they found hints, fragments of symbols etched onto pottery shards, repeating patterns in textile imprints, even a narrow corridor of stones that seemed to line up not with geography, but with the stars. It was as though this community had a cosmology all their own, one that made sense to them and no one else. And in that cosmology, perhaps death had a different shape. The girl with the blade between her vertebrae, she wore something still clinging to her ribs. Beads, shells, bits of twisted copper, not valuable per se, but symbolic. Some thought they were ritual markers. Others believed they were badges, warnings maybe, or titles. And that's when the most controversial theory emerged. What if this wasn't just a killing? What if it was a cleansing, a purge, not of enemies but of chosen ones? The community had flourished, briefly, according to the carbon dating. Agriculture had taken root. Livestock pens, rudimentary though they were, had been maintained. But shortly after the time of the massacre, everything vanished. The site was abandoned, tools left in place, fires snuffed out mid-meal, as though the very ground had been made toxic or sacred. And this girl, this young woman whose bones told of both violence and veneration, became the key, not because of how she died, but because of what happened after. There were traces of resin on her skull, a kind of sap used in embalming, rare, expensive, out of place. Someone had returned to her long after death to anoint her. Why? No one agrees. Some say she was a seer, a scapegoat. Others think she was part of a rite gone wrong. Still others whisper darker stories, of secret cults, of ancient justice, of bloodlines too dangerous to survive. But the truth is simpler. She was someone whose life ended not in natural decline but in deliberate silence, and that silence stretched for centuries. Until now. The wind still brushes over the ridge like it always has. The trees still lean the same direction. The soil, for all its grief, still blooms in spring. But now, the land is watched, by archaeologists, by dreamers, by the curious and the cautious alike. And every year, as they return to scrape back a little more of the past, the same question echoes beneath their tools. Why here? Why them? Why her? And perhaps that is the haunting brilliance of this murder scene, the fact that we may never truly explain it, that its meaning is layered, encrypted, and possibly never meant to be understood by those who did not witness it firsthand. But still, we try. Because in that effort, in the brushes, the scanners, the sleepless nights, It's not just justice we seek, it's connection, a tether across time, a fragile bridge built of bone and soil and questions that don't always need answers to matter, just to be remembered.
The cave was colder than usual that season. The wind howled low and long through the cracks in the cliff face, as if the land itself mourned something left behind. And buried in that chill was a silence more ancient than language. It wasn't just emptiness, it was a place holding its breath. The archaeologists came not looking for ghosts but for data, yet what they found was a paradox. A grave not meant to be found, surrounded by tools not meant to be used, and the bones of a girl who shouldn't have been there at all. Theories had circled for decades, but each time they drew close, something about the case slipped back into shadow, like water escaping cupped hands. Neve's remains had ignited curiosity across continents, not because of what they clearly said, but because of what they refused to say. Most burials speak in patterns. The age of the bones, the artifacts nearby, the alignment of the body, all whisper clues, but Neve's grave was out of tune, like a single dissonant note in a symphony of prehistoric rituals. For one thing, her burial was too careful, not unusual in itself, until one considers her age. She was barely past the threshold of breath, and yet someone had adorned her head with a shell headdress that likely took hours if not days to construct. The shells themselves were foreign to the region, transported from coastal waters many miles away. To give such effort to a life so brief, in a time of brutal survival, suggests a motive deeper than grief. And there was the matter of the ochre, brilliant red. It stained not just the grave but the beads themselves, almost as if her memory was being etched in pigment. Some theorists speculated it had symbolic meaning, blood, perhaps, or protection for the soul. Others suspected practicality, since red ochre can delay decomposition, but the most haunting idea was this. The colour wasn't meant to preserve the child's body, but the memory of her death. More troubling were the flakes of flint found near her side. One had been shaped but not sharpened, a tool that would never cut. Was it meant for the afterlife? Or was it a token from someone close to her, a mother perhaps, offering her labour as tribute? The flint might have represented work, or it might have represented pain. Every layer of sediment that researchers peeled away seemed to thicken the mystery. Her bones told no tale of violence, but neither did they point clearly to disease. She was not sacrificed, but neither was she lost to natural causes in any way that science could yet name. Some suggested starvation, but the burial seemed too swift for such a slow decline. Others pointed to cultural rituals long since lost to time. One researcher, in a moment of exhaustion and wonder, asked aloud what no one dared write down. What if this wasn't a burial at all, but a warning? It was quickly dismissed, of course. There was no evidence of danger, but there was no lack of fear in the way the grave had been placed. Tucked into the farthest recess of the cave, nearly sealed off yet delicately arranged, as if trying to balance reverence and containment, as if something sacred, and possibly volatile, rested there. Among the newer theories was one drawn from comparative anthropology. In certain present-day hunter-gatherer communities, children who die young are not always mourned publicly. Sometimes they are hidden, or even symbolically transformed into ancestors without ever being named. Could Neve's community have held beliefs that blurred the lines between infancy, identity, and spirit? This gave rise to another troubling idea, that Neve's death wasn't seen as a loss, but as a transformation. Not a soul taken too soon, but one already belonging elsewhere. Skeptics called it poetic nonsense, but even they could not explain why so much care was taken for a burial that should have, by logic and evolutionary pressure, been hasty at best. The shells, the ochre, the possible ceremonial garments, these weren't the remnants of grief, they were the vocabulary of myth. One archaeologist, working late into the evening, began cross-referencing burial sites from Eastern Europe, Northern Africa, and the Levant. The pattern she noticed wasn't one of physical artifacts, but of spatial positioning. In each case, a child was buried facing a cave wall, not outward, toward the community or the sun, but inward, toward the rock, toward silence. She wondered if the position had symbolic weight, or was it simply the orientation of those who had laid them to rest? Back at Armaveirana, the data continued to stack up. Fossil pollen hinted that Neve had been buried in late spring. The cave's entrance had already begun to collapse in places, long before modern excavation began. This meant whoever buried her had not chosen convenience, they had chosen concealment, and yet the concealment failed. Millennia later, human hands once again uncovered her, unintentionally, while seeking treasure.
But what they found wasn't gold or weaponry. It was memory, wrapped in earth. The crown of shells, the faintest smile in bone structure, the echo of hands that had placed her there, long after their own lifetimes had ended. What made the case more haunting was that Neve was not alone in the soil. Micro-traces of others, older, more degraded, suggested that this cave had held more than one burial over the ages. Not all were children. Some appeared to be disarticulated adult bones, as if moved, disturbed, or repurposed. A place of mourning? A site of ritual? Or perhaps something stranger?
The problem with ancient murder is not lack of evidence, it's lack of context. We don't know the language, the customs, the fears of those who lived and died back then. A bone can be measured, a tool can be catalogued, but a motive, true motive, can only be guessed. In the quiet hours of excavation, when even the breath of the cave seemed still, some researchers reported hearing the odd acoustics of the stone. Sounds travelled strangely. Whispers echoed longer than they should. A dropped tool could ring through chambers never mapped. Perhaps this had been a sacred space for its resonance, not its location. One theory emerged, tentatively. The cave itself had been chosen not just for protection or seclusion, but for its sound. The burial may have included chant, ritual, music of some kind. Red ochre and echo, colour and voice, forming a bridge between worlds. It's a compelling idea, made stronger by the absence of more practical explanations, and the deeper one digs into Neve's case, the more it resists solution. It refuses to become history. It insists on remaining legend. Some believed the entire story was being misread, that this wasn't a murder at all, but a tragedy made sacred. But even that could not explain the unusual layering of burial materials, the rare inclusion of both tool and ornament, or the geographic complexity of the grave's contents. There were too many contradictions, too many unanswered questions, and then came the genetic revelations. When DNA was extracted from Neve's bones, it did more than map ancestry. It hinted at relatedness, at the possibility that she had kin buried nearby, not in a family grave, but dispersed, scattered across time. Other caves, other bones. As if the family, or the group, had carried sorrow like a migrating flame, passing it from hearth to hearth. And with that, another idea took root. What if this wasn't a burial site, but a narrative site? A place where stories were passed, where pain was remembered not through song or sculpture, but through ritualized deposition. A shrine, not to death, but to continuity. No one knows what Neve's people called themselves. No words survive from their language, no myths, no gods. And yet here she lies, in the centre of a mystery still unfolding. Not a puzzle to be solved, but a chapter to be read slowly, carefully. Because every time we think we understand, the earth reveals something else, a new trace, a different angle, a hint that the story we're telling may be backwards. Maybe she wasn't buried to rest in peace. Maybe she was buried to awaken something long after. And maybe, just maybe, that moment is now. The cold hush of mystery never truly lifts. Not when a body lies where it shouldn't. Not when time forgets names, but remembers wounds. And not when the land itself seems to whisper things it can no longer prove. In all the years of excavating the ancient bones, the weathered tools, the shattered pottery, there are discoveries that rest quietly in the soil. But this one never did. This murder scene has always stirred. In the end, what makes a mystery linger? Is it the brutality of the act? The silence of the victim? The fear of what it suggests? Or is it that nothing, after years of theory, debate, and reconstruction, ever truly fits? Perhaps that's why this one remains unsolved. Because it doesn't just hint at violence. It calls into question everything we thought we knew about the past. Even now, as we step back from the layered forensics, from the carbon dates and the mitochondrial strands, we're left with something more fragile, yet far more human. A feeling, a tremor of recognition, that whoever died here, they were not forgotten, that the death was not meaningless, that someone, long ago, felt rage, or fear, or love twisted into something too sharp to hold. When archaeologists first unearthed the site, they didn't know what they were walking into. It seemed, at first, like any other dig.
bones scattered in the loam, a bit of broken flint, the corner of a hearth. But then the pattern began to emerge. The arrangement wasn't random. The posture of the body suggested constraint, not collapse. The skull was fractured, but in a way that spoke not of time, but of a blow, the kind of blow delivered with purpose. What was once mistaken for a burial site soon began to resemble something darker. A crime scene, lost to time. But in every age patterns remain. The damage spoke a language no one had spoken in 10,000 years, but still, it could be read. The fractured ribs, the dislocated arm, the defensive wounds that even now seem to cry out, "I fought, I tried." And in that posture, so vulnerable, so human, lay the first spark of understanding. But with that understanding came dread. Because there was no clear motive, no looted goods, no signs of enemy incursion, no indications of tribal war. Just one person, isolated, brutalized, and left in the earth. Not with ritual, not with honor, but with haste. That absence of context gave birth to dozens of interpretations. Each scholar brought their own lens, a religious rite gone wrong, a punishment for betrayal, a love turned fatal. Some even suggested sacrifice, though the body bore none of the ceremonial marks one might expect. It was not the symbols etched into the bones that haunted researchers, it was the lack of them. We have grown accustomed to assuming that ancient violence was political or practical, resources, survival, territory. But what if it wasn't? What if this death was intimate, messy, personal? That's harder to categorize, and it's far harder to accept. Because it suggests that prehistoric people didn't just survive, they felt, they hated, they coveted, they lost control. That possibility unsettled the field, and yet the evidence mounted. Fragments of woven cloth near the neck implied a garrote. Tool marks suggested more than one attacker. And then, strangest of all, came the discovery of a single carved bead clutched in the victim's hand. Not worn, not buried with intention. Clutched, as though torn away at the last moment, as though it mattered more than anything else in the final seconds. It wasn't a bead that appeared in local artifacts, it was foreign. Its stone traced to a distant quarry hundreds of kilometres away. And it was old, older than the body itself, a family heirloom perhaps, a talisman, or maybe a bribe, maybe even the very thing that caused the murder. That bead became an axis, a symbol that refused to explain itself. From there the possibilities exploded. Some theorists proposed the victim was a woman of high status, targeted for what she carried or what she knew. Others insisted she was an exile brought back against her will. The bones showed signs of malnutrition, healed fractures, and a pelvis that had once borne a child. Her life had not been easy, but even in its brutality the scene didn't feel like vengeance, it felt like a reckoning. One of the most disturbing features of the burial site was the fire pit beside it, not ancient, but deliberately filled with ashen stones after the body was placed nearby. No food offerings, no funeral pyre, just scorched earth and silence. Was it meant to erase her, or to consecrate the space? As new technologies emerged, teams returned to the site with fresh eyes. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that the terrain had been disturbed multiple times before her burial. Other bodies had been buried nearby, but they were gone now, moved, destroyed, hidden deeper. That question remains unanswered. Worse still, pollen samples from the pit revealed rare alpine flowers, not native to the site. Flowers that would have had to be carried from miles away. Why? Who picks flowers for a murder? And who lays them in ash? Each answer bred new confusion. The deeper researchers dug, the more they found, but the less it explained. And perhaps that's the true shape of this mystery. Not a puzzle with missing pieces, but a mirror. One that reflects our assumptions about the past, about motive, about humanity itself. Because in the end, all we know for certain is that someone died violently. That someone else tried, clumsily, reverently, guiltily, to mark the moment. And that, long after their bones turn to dust, we're still here, listening. What makes this scene unlike others isn't just its unanswered questions, it's how close it feels. As if the wind still carries the echoes, as if the soil itself resists forgetting. There's a weight here, a story that wants to be told, but only in fragments. Maybe that's what keeps us coming back. Not the promise of closure, but the ache of its absence. The knowledge that something important happened here. Something tragic, something human. And we'll never fully know what it was. We tend to think of mystery as something to be solved, but this one refuses, it lingers, it stares back, it asks us not to explain but to witness. And so we do, even now. Conclusion of the story. Some mysteries are meant to be solved, but others, the oldest, the rawest, aren't puzzles at all. They are echoes. Whispers from a time before writing, before law, before history itself. What happened in that ancient clearing or cave or burial pit may never be fully known, but what it reveals is no less powerful. That even in the distant past, humans lived with emotion, ritual, violence, memory, and mourning. This wasn't just a crime scene, it was a story. And though the names are lost and the blood long dried, its weight still lingers. The evidence, scattered bones, foreign beads, missing bodies, doesn't point to a neat ending. It points to a world as complex and fragile as ours. A world where love and hatred, survival and grief, walked hand in hand. Maybe that's the real reason this mystery endures. Not because we don't have answers, but because we still recognize ourselves in the questions. A silent scream from 10,000 years ago, still echoing through time. And so, the story goes on, unearthed piece by piece, told in fragments, felt in the gut. This was not just history. This was human.